It's a HDPE mold from Crafted Elements, and basically you put the wood in here, you clamp it down and pour the epoxy, and then when you're done you dump it out. And there's no leaks with this, so you don't have to build your own mold. It's actually plastic welded. There's plastic seams all the way around it on the outside and inside. This is very useful if you're going to be making a lot of epoxy boards. They also have silicone molds as well, so go check them out.
The wood I chose is walnut, and this one is about 1 inch thick by 16 inches long, and I believe it's about 6 3/4 inches wide. These are 2x4s wrapped in masking tape. It works like tuck tape. This is going to keep the wood from floating to the top when I pour the epoxy, but at the same time the epoxy is not going to stick to it. The second set of clamps were completely unnecessary. I don't know what I was thinking I was going to accomplish by putting these on there.
Here I'm measuring out the white base layer for the board using Black Diamond's Pearl White pigment. I needed 10 ounces of epoxy. Since this is a 1-to-1 ratio epoxy, I'm going to mix 5 ounces of resin and 5 ounces of hardener. This needs to be stirred for about 5 minutes, and I'll go ahead and speed up the video for you. There's no set amount of pigment that's supposed to be mixed with the epoxy. You just kind of keep pouring it in there until you get the right color that you're looking for. Here I'm just using a heat gun to pop all the bubbles in the epoxy. Some people use a blowtorch, but I don't have one. It's very important that your project is level, because most epoxy that I've seen is self-leveling, and it's going to level itself to your project no matter what angle it's at. And here's the first layer. Now I experimented with a few ways of adding the coffee beans into the board, and I found that this is the best way for me. I noticed that when I put clear epoxy on top of the dry coffee beans, it would create more bubbles because of the voids in the beans. The final pour of this board is going to be much thicker than the other two. If
If you're doing multiple layers in one project, you really don't want to wait any more than 24 hours between each pour. You can't see it, but I'm wearing a respirator and have all the windows and doors open in my shop. You need to have good ventilation and some sort of mask on when you're working with epoxy. Now I'm going to stir it for 5 minutes. And then you pour it. As you can see, there's a bunch of bubbles in it. So I'm going to wait about 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'm going to take the heat gun and get those out. Now you just turn it upside down and hammer away. Just be sure there's no cameras sitting on the table with you. Now we got to take this beautiful finish and scratch it up to make it flat. I built this sled for my planer that my boards can ride on. It allows me to shim the corners of the boards. Here I'm just doing a rough sand over the whole board to give me a smooth surface for the router to run on. I'm using a 45-degree bit for the bevel around the top edge. Routing epoxy is a messy job, and planing. Well, come to think of it, anything to do with cutting epoxy. Ah, yes. The first stage of sanding. 80 grit. I decided to do something a little different than I usually do, and that's to use a hand plane to cut the corners on the board. In hindsight, I probably should have just used the sander, because as you can see here, I had some tear out on the corner. But that can be easily fixed with just running the sander along the edges. Now after sanding 80 grit and then moving to 120 grit, I'm going to run it through the water to raise the grain, and this is mostly for the walnut. This process is to keep the board smooth after you wash it for the first time. After letting it dry, I'm going to sand it with 220 grit and then repeat this process one more time. And then after that, I'm going to sand it with 320 grit, and then I'll be able to move on to this process where I move from 800 grit to 3000 grit. This is a polish I use for the epoxy. I'll have a link to it in the description. Next time I'll put some blue painter's tape along the wood so the polish doesn't get in the grain. You may not be able to see it in some of the pictures or video, but it did turn it a little white. And of course, everybody's favorite part, oiling the board. And I am using food grade mineral oil, or oil. Which one is it? Now I didn't do this for this board, but some people actually let it soak in the mineral oil for 24 hours. And that's actually a pretty smart idea. This is the Craig cabinet hardware jig that I just purchased, and it's way more efficient and accurate than the previous way I used to put handles on. It's got adjustable drill guides and built-in measuring scales. But I'll go ahead and show you how I used to put them on, in case you don't have this jig at home. First, you want to get some blue painter's tape and lay it over the top of the holes for the handles. Then you take your pencil and just mark the holes. Position the tape wherever you want it on the board. Then you can take your 3/16 drill bit and drill the holes that you marked using the screws that came with the handle as a depth gauge. But we're going to use the jig, and I'm going to use the blue painter's tape as a pad to keep the jig from scratching up the surface of the board. It also doubles as a marking surface. One trick I learned to help with tear out was to put a piece of wood behind the board while you're drilling. As you can see here, I forgot to do this on this side. I'm using this countersink bit to sink the heads of the screws into the board, that way they're not sticking out. This will allow the board to be flush on the bottom. I'm using Howard's Butcher Block conditioner as a wax and vinyl finish, and the special applicator from Clark's. It helps massage the wax into the grain of the board. This will help give the board a good shine. All that's left is to buff it with a soft cloth and you're done. You now have a very unique serving tray.